Hello, everyone. My name is Zorica Buser, and I am here with my co-host, Professor Mark Erwin from University of Toronto, Department of Orthopedic Surgery. We are part of section, NAS section on biologics and basic research. And thank you for joining us for our second podcast in the series focusing on disc degeneration and regenerative modalities. The title of today's podcast is Pain of Disc Origin. Why does it hurt and from where? And I think, Mark, in last podcast, we covered the basics of disc degeneration, aging versus painful disc. And I think really the next step is to dive deeper and detangle some of the topics that are still very controversial when it comes to where does the pain come from? What are the tools that we have? And I think really the first step is to discuss further where the pain comes from. Is it discogenic or is it vertebrogenic pain? And I would love to hear your opinion on that.
Thanks, Zori, and welcome to the podcast, everyone. Yeah, so the difficulty, as we know, dealing with pain of discogenic origin is exactly as Zori said. Well, where does it come from? Well, we know the disc is very well innervated, from the end plates and the annulus in particular, the outer few millimeters, and there are mechanoreceptors, there are nociceptors, and the basic, fundamental developmental reason for the innervation is to inform paraspinal musculature to maintain posture. And that's, principally what the innervation is all about. However, we know that with degeneration or injury, that whole thing changes such that even carrying a heavy briefcase can throw a patient into spasm. Why does that happen? Well, we know from last time's discussion, there's a lot of inflammation involved with disc degeneration in particular that drives certain cellular changes within the disc that results in phenotypic changes, loss of extracellular matrix integrity and cell ECM integrity and so forth. But associated with that, there are changes in the innervation of the disc, such that it's been shown before in human discs that are obtained from surgery for presumptive painful discs that they highly express a number of what are called neurotrophins, such as nerve growth factor receptor, and BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, plus some neuropeptides like CGRP and substance P. These are highly expressed in painful discs, and a number of animal studies have been looked at involving disc injury, like puncture models, that have shown the same thing. In fact, I think a really interesting study published some years ago. It was I have it right here. It published in 2010 from Takahashi's group in Chiba in Japan, and they used rats, and they used a 23 gauge needle and multiple punctures in the disc. Then they added fluorogold retrotracing compound to the disc, and they found that the discs that had that kind of labeling, the dorsal root ganglia that subserved those discs, lit up with a CGRP expression, much more so than discs that were not injured. So the idea being there that it seems that there's a significant association of increased pain associated with disc degeneration. Now, other studies have shown that the annulus in damaged discs also robustly increased neurotrophins, neuropeptides, all of which lead to an increased sensitization of pain. So that's neurotrophins as well as neuropeptides. And neuropeptides are well known in other pain models to be involved in transmission of pain. So we know that under pro-inflammatory degenerative conditions, that the disc's cellular sort of changes occur such that they're much more associated with pain. Also, we know that with inflammation, and Permusser and Tony Fremont's groups have also shown that there can be ingrowth of nerves into the disc, normally in non-innervated areas. And other studies have shown that discs obtained from humans cultured with rat dorsal root ganglia robustly increase the growth of nerves in these cultured DRGs. So there's something going on in the inflamed disc that results in increased neurogenic kind of pain. But there's more to this. We also know in more recent years that other structures associated with disc that may be painful. So Like Zori, can you talk about that? There's something else that many people don't know about that may be associated with discogenic pain.
Yeah, and I think definitely, I believe, as you said, recently in the past 5 or maybe 10 years, there has been not necessarily a shift, but new theory and evidence that maybe actually the pain is not necessarily discogenic, but it's vertebrogenic, which is coming from changes in the end plate structures. As we know, when we think about the disc, and we've talked about this in our first podcast, it's the largest vascular, cellular organ, really minimal transport. That's why it's so challenging with regenerative therapies. But end plates really represent one of the, from one side, obviously, end plates are really important for load distribution, but at the same time for nutrient transport. So what a lot of clinical and basic science research has shown in the past 10 years is that there are changes in morphology and structure of the end plates that point at potentially being sources of pain. And a point further, actually, just recently, one of the, from Easels Society, actually, one of the prize papers showed that the end plate changes are not just seen as a point of pain in older people, but also in young adults and younger population. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, and we've discussed this in the our first podcast, that it's not necessarily the aging disc, that everything happens just because we age and get older. So what to really kind of dive a little bit deeper when it comes to end plate, what various studies in systematic reviews have shown that changes in the end plates itself, but also bone marrow, have been correlated with low back pain and even some subtypes of low back pain. And some of those changes that we've seen in various studies from different groups that truly focus on end plates are definitely Modic 1 and 2, also Schmorl nodes, as well as end plate lesions, various lesions that studies have shown that they really correlate with chronic low back pain. And then when we think really further about the end plates, we have to also keep in mind that as disc, end plates are have a high healthy end plates have a high content of water. It's I believe the healthy end plate is 50 to 60%. I think nucleus is 90%. So when we think about those changes and progressions, to your point, with the nerve ingrowth, pro-inflammatory markers that are obviously flooding the disc, there are definitely structures in the end plates that are changing. So diffusion is changing, permeability of the end plates is changing, and that all can contribute based on the research that has been done and shown in clinical studies and some basic science models that the source of pain is really from the end plate. But then what that really, I think, Mark, triggers as a next important point is, how do we measure it? Is it coming from end plate, or is it coming from disc itself? And obviously, it can be annulus, nucleus, but I think that's a big question mark if we have a reliable tool. And I know it's a tough question to answer.
Well, indeed, it's a perplexing one. It's one that's challenged the field for a long time, and it continues to do so. I think that most people are aware that the gold standard, though I think, again, not the best quality of gold, was probably been provocative discography for many years. And that's got its drawbacks, right? There's some studies talking about, the idea of puncturing the disc and pressurizing it, and that may lead to more degeneration down the road, though there's some questions about the caliber of the disc or the gauge of the needle and how much pressure one uses. So it's very operator dependent kind of investigational or diagnostic tool, though in the past that's been used to identify the painful disc. However, to your point, how does that work if the pain is of end plate origin, right? So I think we've kind of had tunnel vision for many years, thinking, well, it's got to be the disc. So the idea of overpressurization to reproduce the patient's pain or injecting anesthetic into the disc in an anesthetic kind of discography is another way of seeing if it can ameliorate the patient's pain, therefore confirming that's the place. But I don't know how that works if the patient's pain is end plate or both. Like, it's very unlikely that we have a binary thing here. It's likely a combination of all of these things, neurotrophic neuropeptide, and just a sort of neurogenic mediated pain from a variety of sources. So, I think we alluded to it last time, but we certainly will in an upcoming podcast where we're going to talk about imaging and pain. And there is, coming down the road, there are some potentially really, really interesting methods that might be able to delineate where pain is coming from in a non-invasive way, such as MRI spectroscopy or ultra short, echo time acquisition of end plate signals. I didn't mention it earlier, though I think maybe before the last, I want not to miss this, that with degeneration, we know the advent of MRI spectroscopy based upon chemical change in the disc, that alanine, propionic acid, lactic acid accumulate. And these have been shown to have a high correlation with discography in painful patients. So there are all kinds of reasons why the disc may be painful. And as these imaging systems and diagnostic systems come on stream and hopefully can be validated in larger population studies, maybe we'll be able to delineate who's got pain and from where. For example, if we find out that patient X has a primary disc pain, it looks like it's mostly nucleus based on, whatever method we use, then that person may get this treatment. On the other hand, if it looks like this person's pain is maybe more of end plate origin, maybe they get a different kind of treatment, right? So I think that maybe as we get further along in our ability to diagnose where the pain is coming from and to some degree why, that may inform us better as to what the next treatment might be, as opposed to, we only have, surgery or something, right? So, and if it's an injectable treatment, what should it be? Should it be stem cells? Should it be some other thing? So again, knowing better where it's coming from, it being the pain, of course, may inform us further of where we ought to go. So Lori, further on that note, taking a step back now, looking at this degenerative disc with this inflammatory stuff, this biomechanical components, maybe end plate, maybe nucleus, annulus changes. Where do you think we're going to go here in terms of being able to properly work up the patient down the road to help to define where the pain is coming from and what we should do?
That's another tough one, and I think you alluded that really the first step would be to have proper imaging done, and especially now with artificial intelligence, with predictive analytics, with all the new advances that we have, that we can, to your point, hopefully down the road have that individual option and treatment designed for every single patient. But I think it will be really important, and I think to also consider risk factors. And we briefly discussed that in our first podcast, because no patient is the same, even if it's just L4-5, the disc that it's bothering them and it's maybe cause of pain. So I think having a really good assessment, and again, that will start with the imaging and maybe some medical history. It will help us at least start designing proper therapies. Right. And I think there are a lot of efforts. And there are a lot of efforts from different groups interested in disc regeneration that are trying to do that and complement that with the physical therapy and surgical and non-surgical options to really have that big picture and all elements needed.
And I think it's important also as we go further towards the regenerative approaches, we have to understand that patients come to the doctor because their back hurts. Right. Yep. So mustn't lose, again, the key title of this podcast is pain. So if we try a lot of effort to regenerating the disc, we have to not lose track of where we're going. Is what do we do about the pain? And that it's too much for today, but we must not lose sight of the psychometric aspects of pain. So the patient's got these tissue sources of pain that we discussed already. That results in, cognitive changes too, right? And so then where the rubber meets the road here is not always so clear. But I just think it's important for us to not lose sight of, in terms of disc regeneration and imaging and all that stuff. The key here is how do we deal with the pain, right? So I think that might be a good segue for our next podcast, which will be all about imaging and methods to try to delineate better where the pain is coming from and how can we quantify it. Does that sound fair?
Very fair. Thank you all. Thank you for joining us. Mark, good seeing you.
You too. See you next time, everybody.